Oh, hi everyone, thanks for joining us again to the last part of the ABR series. I know you've been waiting for quite a while to actually see the data that we've acquired a couple of weeks ago, but here we are today and bringing all these files into the PDF reader of BioSemi and then comparing also the same stuff in using BESA. So let's get started, but one important point I have to make is to reiterate why we're using the ActiveTwo to do auditory evoked potentials. Using the ActiveTwo for ABR. ABR is a special case of EEG where we see two distinct attributes. The ABR information is above approximately 100 Hz, whereas the EEG information reaches down to as low as 0.01 Hz. The ABR design uses only 3 electrodes, whereas EEG uses tens or even hundreds of electrodes. These two attributes allow the designer to optimize performance by making different trade-offs for the ABR channels. In the active electrode, we can use a high-gain AC amplifier instead of the low-gain DC amplifier used for standard EEG. High gain in the first stage lifts the signal and noise far above the noise floor of the following amplifier stages, and the analog to digital converter resulting in an overall lower noise level. The limited number of electrodes allow the selection of components with a lower noise but higher power consumption. However, these design choices cannot be used in the standard case where besides low noise, DC operation and low power consumption are also key specifications. Let me say something very important. As we will analyze the data, what I've just read out will make it clear when we look at the two data sets using the LMON, the REV and the RMON, which act similar to EEG electrodes, whereas the left and the right electrodes will show much different signal quality. So let's go and use the PDF reader to open the Surpass ABR file first that we've acquired on Philip. I will show you some really cool features using the PDF reader. That version is now also 902. Which is a fantastic reader. We can even do some stuff that other programs like BESA or EEG Lab or Field Trip can't even do. The PDF reader, which is free of charge, will give you a lot of nice features, which I will show you using the Surpass file first. Then we'll open the presentation stimulation file that we did. I show you some differences. Also showing you the stimulus artifact on using a TDH39, and on the presentation stimulation file we use some really high noise, cheap tubal insert earphones, which are actual insert phones, not tubal inserts, because there's no tube like with etymotic research. So let's get started. Let's open the file. You have been waiting long enough and I apologize for that. But we had to find time to actually come to the point where we show some really nice analysis using the Surpass stimulation versus the presentation one-shot triggering file, so we can compare what does the triggering, how does the triggering influence these two data sets, and you will see very quickly what I'm trying to actually see and show you here. All right, let's get started with that. Now, I will show you first, like I said before, ActiRead 902. Fantastic analysis software. Doesn't do too much, but it can do what it does it really effectively, and I will show you some really cool stuff. So we go to the desktop. Obviously, we would have downloaded ActiRead 902. ActiRead is not ActiveTwo. ActiveTwo, just to say it again, is the acquisition program. The BDF reader, as it was called in the past, is now called ActiRead. And there is also a third brother of these two software components, which is called ActiveTools. And ActiveTools allows you to do EDF export, it allows you to decimate, it allows you to change the header, that's new. It will give you some other features. Download the software, it's available from biosemi.com, beautiful. All right, let's get started. So we open ActiRead 902 for Windows. We will go to maximize screen, which is just beautiful. Same as ActiveTwo, same thing. So first of all, I want to show you quickly some stuff. We have new tabs, one called Monopolar Zoom, one called Value, and another one which has been added in the latest versions is a tab called ERP. So let's open the file that we did on Philip using the Surpass as the click stimulator. So we select this file. If you can't find it, make sure to click either all files or make sure it ends with PDF. So we open this file here. As soon as we open it, we won't see anything in the ERP screen, but let's go over to Monopolar Display. In Monopolar Display, we will see the 5 traces that we've collected. The LMON, the REF, and the RMON, as previously explained, and probably many times already, but it's always good to re-emphasize what they are versus the left and the right channel. The LMON, the REF, and the RMON are channels similar to EEG. They're not amplified channels. They have full bandwidth, meaning from DC, 1/5 of the sample rate, and they're not actually referenced. They are referenced to CMS, but in effect, they need to be referenced if we want to see something nice. The left and the right channels, however, are amplified channels. They have a bandwidth, which is 100 to 3.3 kilohertz, and they are referenced already, so they're bipolar channels. We don't need to do anything to these because they've already been referenced to the reference channel. So what we can do here in the monopolar display, we can change the sensitivity. And as you can see, it actually automatically modifies the traces to our sensitivity settings. In the past, we had to actually jump one forward, or come backwards. In fact, when we move forward, we can suddenly see the triggers coming on the screen. On the bottom, you can see them right here, the brown little dots. We can change the filters if we wanted. We can apply a low pass of, say, 1000 Hertz if you wanted to. And with the low pass, we could apply a 100 Hertz low frequency filter. But the problem is the software is actually made so that the highest low frequency or high pass filter we can put in is 9.9 Hertz. It doesn't make any difference if we go above 10 Hertz anyway, because we have a very, very short time base. So that's okay. So we can selectively say we just want to see this channel, we want to see the reference channel, or we want to see the right or the left channel by clicking one of these channels. If you want to see all of them, we press the Shift button, we can get them back all on the screen. We can then go back to our sensitivity lever, which I probably choose about 200 microvolts. That looks pretty good. So beautifully color-coded traces. The LMON would be, in this particular instance, brown. The REF would be red. RMON would be orange. Left channel would be yellow. And the green would be allocated to right. We can apply a reference if we wanted to. So obviously, if we wanted to apply a reference to all the channels, it would be senseless because, like I said before, the left and the right channel are already referenced to the reference channel. So they're bipolar channels, these two guys here, and these three here are monopolar channels. So if you wanted to reference any of these channels, the only sense that it would make if we click these three channels here and then reference these to channel number 2, which is the reference channel. Automatically, we now have also bipolar channels that we display. The LMON is now referenced to REF, and the RMON is reference to ref, and the ref is reference to ref, that's why it's a flat line. So there's not much more we can do with the monopolar display, which is okay, fair enough. Let's move over to monopolar zoom. This is really a cool little feature here. In monopolar zoom, this is really made to actually check trigger length, to check timing, etc., etc. It's a very, very new, nice tab to use, especially if people want to scrutinize triggers, etc., etc., etc. So let's just click on channel 4, which is the left channel. That's in fact the channel that we stimulated using the Surpass clicker. When we click here, well, let's just remove the reference because, like I said, this is a bipolar channel, even though it just says left, but this is reference to ref. On the bottom, we can see the brown little ticks. These are trigger markers number 1. Remember, we actually have an input on the USB receiver of 16 bits. However, we only use a single first bit as our trigger marker number 1 from the stimulation system called the Surpass from EMS. Now, we see the little the trigger marks on the bottom here, these brown little guys here. In fact, if we had 16 bits that were incoming, we would have 16 colors going from top to bottom. Remember, the first half is the low byte section, triggers 1 to 255. And the second part of this screen is the high byte sections, trigger marks 9 to 16, respectively 256 to 65,000 and something. Okay? So what we can do here is beautiful. Let's see how long was the actual trigger that we sent. What we can do is we can click here on multiplier, and we can move these little guys, these little levers, the blue lever and the right lever, we can move them together to actually stretch the whole screen. So we can see the trigger becomes longer and longer, and the waveform is expanded longer and longer and longer. So let's pull a little bit more until these guys get really big. If they're not big enough, we can multiply again, and we get the full gain again to pull in and to stretch. So we can really stretch and make them really, really big. Okay? So what we can also do, this is a beautiful little feature, we can actually show each sample. Remember, when we recorded this file, we recorded it with 16 kilohertz with a bandwidth of 3,300 hertz. So when I look at the waveform here, even though I've zoomed in quite a bit, I still can't see the samples. If I pull a little bit more, suddenly each sample will become visible. Takes a little bit longer. We have to really stretch the waveform harder and harder. And now they start to appear. You can see the little dots here building the actual waveform. These are called the actual samples, as you can see here nicely, even with the trigger. Okay, so let's now look at how long was the actual trigger that we've supplied. So we will bring one of the trigger markers back to about center. Now we have two levers here. We have two cursors. We have one cursor that we can move to the left and one cursor we can move to the right. Now obviously if they're opposite, vice versa, we will see a negative interval, which here would be 7.99 milliseconds in the minus. So we know immediately this cursor is wrong. So let's move this cursor to the right, and let's move it to the end of the actual marker. Let's use the left marker, move it to the beginning of the trigger, which is about here. And we know that the Surpass click stimulation system output a trigger length of 20 milliseconds. In fact, if we look at this value here, this is very, very faithfully done by the clicking system from EMS Biomedical in Austria. Now, if you say, yeah, but it's not 20.2, it actually should be 20. Well, let's stretch the trace a little bit more. Let's make it really wide, because I'm sure that my levers are not optimally positioned, which they aren't. So if I move this right to the first marker, I can see exactly 20 milliseconds. So EMS has done a perfect job by delivering a 20 millisecond long trigger. This is a nice little tool here called monopolar zoom, where you can actually scrutinize your waveform, you can scrutinize trigger length. If we had different, let's just grab another file quickly, this is really nice to show. Important to understand as well, we have here a visual evoked potential, where I've actually caught some triggers via the ergo input, and there they are, the big things here. So those big rectangular stimulations here. So if you wanted to see what is the actual trigger versus, let's do full bandwidth, so that doesn't look as abnormal as it should look. So there's a rectangular trigger coming through, and down here are the trigger marks according to that. So if we stretch those to see the timing for what's happening on the screen and when is the trigger output, we can go about like this, and we can move this trigger and this trigger to the appropriate places. So basically here was the trigger supplied via the ergo one-shot triggering. That's why, of course, these triggers are much earlier than the ergo trigger. And as we can see, it's already clear that the actual onset of the trigger is exactly at the same time as the trigger came through. Probably a difference of 200 micro or something, but that would be really neglectable. So this monopolar zoom tab allows you to do all these kinds of stuff really, really nice. So let's go back and just open our PDF file for the surpass, because we want to see the evoked potential. So let's go back to monopolar display, make sure all the channels are actually shown on screen, which they are. Now we're looking at 5 volt, that's why we can't see any deflection. So let's move over to value. There's another tab here. Value is actually an interesting tab, especially if you want to do one-shot triggering, and we need to know how big the amplitude is of the actual one-shot trigger coming through. To scrutinize that, we click on the value tab and we see a trace. We could see a trigger. And of course, you can actually also zoom on that one. And what we do here is we zoom right into a event. Here is a pretty big event. So when we use this marker here, we can actually move to the absolute offset, which is around here. So this point here, the absolute amplitude going negative in this case, to baseline would be 27.7 microvolts. Knowing that, we can adjust our one-shot triggering amplitude window or level according to what the actual input noise would be. So it is a nice little tab. Value can be used to measure the noise level. Very, very nice. But let's now see what we've recorded. I know you've been all waiting for. We can even check the offsets here. By the way, the offsets we can toggle through. They're not static, so they move through every sweep. We can see the offsets changing. It's pretty good after 12 months if you want to see the actual quality of your electrode, whether they've deteriorated or not. You can check the offset today and compare with what you've done 12 months ago. Let's head over to ERP now, because this is why we're here. This is what we do today. And excuse me if I explained so much, if I've given you so much information, but it's really, really handy to know. And by the amounts of emails we get from people asking questions and the forums full of questions, I thought to give you a real good rundown on what ActiRead or BESA or a file that we've acquired can actually do. All right, so here we go. We've got the ERP screen open. The file is already downloaded. It's already here. So what we need to do is we need to do a few settings. Remember, the trigger we supplied was a 5 volt TTL trigger on the first input of the USB receiver. That's a 5 volt trigger. Not one-shot triggering, it's a 5 volt USB receiver trigger input on trigger 1. Not 2, not 3, on 1. Because remember, when we look at the screen here, we can see the brown little dots. That shows they came in on line number 1. So what we do is, we know it's an auditory evoked potential, so let's put in a sweep rate of 10 milliseconds, because we expect to see waveforms 1 to 5. Anything else, like a mid-latency response or a cortical response, would be much later, and it's not a DC potential anyway. This is an ABR, should arrive within 10 milliseconds, so we set this sweep length to 10 milliseconds. We don't have to click the low or the high pass, because what we will do is we will average on the left channel. Remember, the left channel is a bipolar channel, so we don't need to apply a bandwidth, because the bandwidth is already applied to that particular channel, left or right. Well, we've stimulated the left ear, hence we're gonna put the left channel here. So we don't click any of these. That means we leave it to full bandwidth. If we wanted to limit the bandwidth, we can put a click and change the value, but we're not gonna do that. Okay, we leave that on auto scale, and that's okay. We can see what the trace is like in size after we've actually acquired it. One important fact is that you have to set is positive up has to be negative up. Now, why am I saying that? Obviously, the ABR is a positive potential. It's a DC potential, which will go upwards, because positive is typically up, negative is typically down, depending on where you are. Remember, when we installed the electrodes, we have 2 electrodes. We have the left, the right, LMON, RMON, reference, and CMS-DRL. However, as the concept of the design is that the EEG electrodes are all on the head, they're all negative electrodes, so to speak, and the reference is the positive electrode. In this particular sense is we use this electrode on the roof of the head, not as a positive electrode, but as a negative. It's the hardware design. So when we toggle it to negative up, we will actually look at the positive signal going upwards. It's just the other way around. All right? Here we can actually set some reject functions. We can reject on 100 or more. I'd leave them to about 100 to over 50. So it's the left channel we actually average. However, it's a bipolar channel, hence we do not need a reference. Hence we click somewhere in the gray. Now we have not allocated a reference because this channel and this channel are already referenced channel to ref. Okay. The only last little button we have to set or put a value in is when you wish to end the scan. Scan means it goes through all the sweeps and then gives me an average. Now let's quickly have a look how long is the file. It's 412 seconds long. That's how long Philip had to withstand the torture of this TDH39 on his ears with a loudness of 80 decibel, which is quite loud. Presentation was much softer. That's why we expect a delayed response 5 there, but let's see when we get to it. So what we do is we put in here 412 because the file was 412 seconds long. So we just put in 412. I mean, you can put in 10 seconds if you want. It will just average 10 seconds. But we want to average the entire file. That's it. Nothing more to do. Hit the start average button and immediately we can see the beautiful auditory evoked potential coming up on the screen. We've already seen that whilst we did the acquisition, but because we were filming and the cameras were all over the place, you might not have seen it online, real time on the screen. So we do it offline now using the PDF reader, or as it's called today, the ActiRead program. That's it. The average is done. Look at it, how beautiful it came out. It surprises me not because I've already done it before. Don't tell anyone. So what we have here is we end up with a waveform. We actually end up with 2 waveforms. One is gray and one is red. Now, red doesn't mean it's the right ear, it's just red because of the first trace. When we look at the actual responses on the screen, we see the gray. The gray is the noise. Looking at the screen now, what we can already see is a beautiful, now I say beautiful, you don't want to probably see that, but I like to see the stimulus artifact, because the stimulus artifact shows us that actually the recording did something. So it evoked a stimulation artifact just on the ear, because that's where the headphones were plugged on the head. And obviously we've set that to rarefaction. Had we set the headphone stimulus to alternation, it would have averaged the stimulus artifact out. We would have probably had a straight line. But we did it to rarefaction. That means it actually pulls the eardrum. And by pulling the eardrum near the electrode, it would give us an actual positive response. It actually is positive as it's going down. We're showing negative up. Remember, the ABR is positive, but due to the actual connections in the amplifier, in the ADC box of BioSemi, it's actually the other way around. Okay, so here is the stimulus artifact. It lasts to about, I'd say, to about here. That's where the stimulus artifact goes back to zero. Straight after that, following is our waveform 1, our waveform 2, 3, 4, and 5 right here, I would think. So let's place this marker on the front, because this is our left marker. Let's put this time marker on where we believe is 5, which is around here. And looking at the timing, I can see a delay of 5.81 milliseconds, which is absolutely in the green. We can say this is waveform 5 without the shadow of a doubt. If I place marker left to where 1 is, I can see a difference of 3.85 milliseconds, which is typically normal between the cochlea and the brainstem. We have a difference latency of anything between 3.8 to 4.2 milliseconds. Of course, if you have different values, different statistical values, for newborns it will be different than for adults, etc. That's fine. But we're not proving any medical diagnosis here, because this is research-only system and instruments. And so what we are actually doing, we are proving with the stimulus artifact, with the waveforms, with the accuracy of the timing, that we're actually collected a very, very beautiful auditory evoked potential using the ActiveTwo from BioSemi. Now that's been stimulated with the surpass, very accurate, trigger out, stimulus out, results are beautiful. If you want to save this, you can press on Save to PNG. We can put it on the desktop and we can call it Surpass ABR, fill, save that, and done. If we go to our desktop and we go here, we can actually see a JPEG file or a PNG file created. You can use this for your publications, etc., etc. That's very, very lovely. Had we done parallel to the auditory evoked potential also an EEG, the EEG data would also be, of course, on that ActiRead software. We could have also done an average on any other channels, and we may have collected also an ABR, but the ABR would have looked different. Now let's just quickly touch base again on what I said before about AC, DC, and these two different electrode types that we're using. Let's do an average as a comparison on the Elmon, which is also the left mastoid, the stimulated ear, but this time choose a reference because it's a monopolar channel. So let's leave the settings exactly the same and let's start an average using the Elmon. That should be more noisy, otherwise the hypothesis behind it is not true. So let's do an average on that. Immediately we can see on the screen it's much more noisy, and that's okay. The latencies will be the same. Remember also that these electrodes have an open bandwidth, so DC 3300 Hertz. That is why it's even more noisy than when we compare to what we've done before with the bipolar left channel. We have not set a bandwidth. As soon as we hit the bandwidth here, we go to 3000 Hertz over a high pass of 100 Hertz. You shouldn't go much higher because of the amplitude decrease. And let's start the whole thing again. And immediately you can see it looks similar to what we've done before with a bipolar amplified and AC channel compared to this L-mount channel, which is essentially like one of the EEG channels when we do an EEG. So that's coming up reasonably nice. And I think we're getting pretty much the same values. As soon as it's finished, we can actually move the marker 5. It's a little bit delayed, but still not that much delayed, over to where we believe 5 is. And we're resulting in about 0.1 millisecond delay. And that's due to the actual filtering. That's due to the actual noise component in the file. You can also see the background noise. It's higher than what we've done with the left channel before. I think that beautifully wraps up what the BDF reader can do. However, with the presentation stimulus, one set trigger file, we'll use BESA to do this. But I think this gives you a beautiful overview of what the new ActiRead 902 can do for you. You can save a lot of money because this is free and it's been programmed by BioSemi beautifully. There is a lot of new features, and with no doubt there will be more features coming in the near future. So watch out, go back to the website of BioSemi, to the download section, and see whether there will be a newer version of 902. And if so, download it, play with it. It's really cool and it's free. So there you go. So let's head over now to BESA to see what that file looks when we open BESA. All right? All right, we're back. Let's open BESA. BESA that we are using at the moment is version 7.1, which has some added new features. BESA is a really nice software. It's not free. Can be used to do quite a lot of stuff like source analysis. It can also do MRI, co-registration, etc., etc. BESA is very, very nice. BESA has been on the market for a long time. It allows to do, as you can see here, we can do ERPs, we can do artifact rejections, we can do ICA, we can do source analysis, we can run, we can pull in an MRI, co-registration of a file, etc. Very, very nice software. You can purchase BESA at the moment with us. We have a special on our web shop for BESA, so it's probably worth your while checking what the prices are. For what we're going to do now, we don't need an expensive package. We can just do with BESA Basic, which is really nice. So what we do is we open our file that's called Surpass file. Now, when I go to the directory called Surpass ABR, I won't see anything because you have to make sure to toggle this to the appropriate file ending called Philip ABR Surpass PDF. When we hit the button, it actually reads in the demographics of that particular subject. In fact, while it's opening the file, we can quickly go over to File, we can go to Head, Surface Points and Sensors and load coordinate files. And there we can see the actual header of the file. We can see how many channels we recorded. We didn't record just 5, we recorded 6 channels. One is the status or the trigger channel. The others are L-mon, ref, R-mon, left and right. I can say it better and better as I say it many more times. There you also have the attached file points, etc., etc., etc. So all the stuff that belongs to that file is found here in the demographics here. Okay, so here's the file. We can immediately see the L-mon, the ref, the R-mon, the left the right and the status channel. Now let's actually remove this channel as bad. We don't want to see it. We don't want to take it into our average. Here it's okay because it's a TTL. But remember, with the one-shot triggering using presentation, we have to disable that because those incoming triggers are ergo responses as well, and they will be averaged, really messing up with our file. What we can do here is actually quite nice. We can set a montage. We can create a montage because remember, L-mon, Ref, and R-mon are monopolar channels, whereas these two guys here don't need to be referenced. They already are with reference. So I'll click on Montage Editor. It will open this window here. Here we can say, let's choose the original recording. Let's edit. Okay, what do we want to edit? We want to select this channel and this channel. And we can also select this channel if you wanted to. Press Set Reference and click on Ref. So it actually allocates reference to the L and to the right channel. On the left and the right, we do not need to do that because they are bipolar. Said it many times, say it again. I get out of here, I say yes to save, and I call it ActiveTwo Reference ABR. Something like that. You can choose any other name if you want. When you let go of the button, immediately you will see the channels are montaged now. So the L-mon is reference to Ref. So essentially it's similar to this channel here, it's basically the same. Ref is refed to Ref, so that's a flat line. And the right channel is reference to reference. That's why you see these two channels here as bipolar channels. These already are bipolar channels, although it doesn't say explicitly here, but that's okay. We know they're bipolar, they're amplified, and they have a bandwidth applied. So what we do is quickly we change the actual bandwidth to all the channels, that including the L-mon and the R-mon. So we put in 100 Hertz to 3 kilohertz. And if we wanted, because we had everything set up on a table, we had some 50 Hertz as well. This would be 60 Hertz for the US, so we put in 50 Hertz for Europe. And we say okay to that. And immediately the channels look all now very similar. Remember before, when we didn't have these filters applied, the L-mon and the R-mon and the Ref channels were very, very noisy as compared to the left and the right. And that's for said reasons in the beginning of this particular video. Let's move over here and let's put the sensitivity to about 10 microvolts. Let's leave it at that, that's fine. Let's change the time base because we will end up with a 100, let's say 10 millisecond response, but let's put this to 100 milliseconds, which it is now. And so this looks to me pretty good. We can move forward until we start to see some trigger markers. Now this is 417 seconds long, so let's better grab this little handle here. And when we see this black stuff here, we can see the triggers coming through now. Trigger 1 is the first bit, the first line going into the USB receiver versus pin 37 being our ground. So if we move forward here, we can see another trigger 1 here. So somewhere between this trigger 1 and the next trigger 1 is embedded our auditory evoked potential. That's all very nice. We can actually move across a waveform like this, and it'll show us some features. It shows us the amplitudes, the frequency in that particular segment, etc., etc. So that's all very nice. In fact, we can draw over it. We can press FFT, and immediately, if we do this a bit better, we can actually see the actual FFT of all the channels shown here. This is actually quite nice too, because when we look at that, we can actually see again that the left and the right channel are nicer in terms of noise than all our normal left and right channels that are in effect like the EEG channels on the ActiveTwo. All right, so that's good. We've seen enough. There's not much more we can do. I mean, we've only got 6 channels, or 5 channels, I should say. What we have also collected 128 channels along with our ABR channels. That'll be hefty. We can do much more. We can do source analysis, all that sort of stuff using BESA. But what we want to do is see what is the outcome if we run an average on these traces right now. So we go to ERP, we hit the button average. We start first with trigger. The trigger 1, let's call it ABR 1, which we will define, add to list and set. So any trigger markers 1 that will come in would create an ABR, and we call it 1. Let's move to condition. So in the condition, we can call it AEP surpass. Just, oh, got it wrong there. Surpass, like this. The current code is 1. We insert that, and immediately it actually shows us how many of those triggers that came through were counted. There were 4,051 triggers. So that's pretty. It's a lot of triggers. So we've done pretty well. We could have done it a little bit longer. That's okay. We go to epoch. In epoch, we set 0 to say 10 milliseconds because our ABR is somewhere between 0 and 6 milliseconds, maybe 7. We don't do a baseline definition. We do not do an artifact rejection. We could do because we're using headphones. And the artifact, the stimulus artifact on the beginning would actually smear over our waveform 1, possibly. So we could put an artifact rejection in or a stimulus artifact rejection right here. We're not going to do that. Had we used ER 1, 2, or 3s from Etymodic, also put in a delay of 0.9 milliseconds because the tube length of those ER 1, 2, 3s will give us a delay of 0.9 milliseconds. We're not going to do that because we used on-ear headphones. So we assign to selected. We have to assign our parameters to that particular trace. So we go to filters. We're not doing any filtering. We could run an artifact scan that would show us, if you do EEG, much better. That would show us how many sweeps are contaminated too much with noise and how many channels are really bad. We can't do that because we only have 5 channels. So we leave that out. We go to average, and here we can start pressing the average button. And that will take a minute or 2. And as soon as that's run through, I will be back. All right, that's finished. We end up with a right average buffer. So we just say save. We can give it a comment if you want it. Just press go ahead with that. And we will see on the screen now something that's not making much sense at the moment. So let's make that big screen. Let's move this over here. Now that's given us a top data viewer of what we've actually averaged. Now remember, on the back here, let's just close this down quickly. On the back here, we're looking at an average buffer. We no longer look at sweeps. So obviously this is pretty long because we need to put that down to about 100 milliseconds. So here we go. We're looking at 100 milliseconds from left to right, obviously showing us only a tenth, which is the 10 milliseconds that we've averaged around. Immediately we can see the 5 traces again. The status trace, which is the trigger trace, we have just disabled. We don't want to see that. Immediately we see the LMON, that's the stimulated ear. We see the reference, and that's practically 0 because it's referenced reference to CMS. And the RMON, which is also pretty squiggly, compared to left and right, which are bipolar channels, amplified, and bandwidth channel, AC channels from 100 to 3.3 kilohertz. So that looks pretty smooth compared to these 3 traces here. So all we need to do is go to user montages and select the ActiveTwo reference ABR montage channels. So now we're looking beautifully at L-mon to ref, bipolar, ref to ref, zero line because it's ref to ref. R-mon to ref, that's the not stimulated ear, that's the masked ear. You may remember we put a masking of minus 30 decibel to the stimulated ear being 80 decibel, so this is 50 dB to prevent conduction across the skull if somebody had otosclerosis. We look at the left and the right bipolar channels. Again, we see the stimulus artifact, and that's beautiful. So let's go to top view of data. And when we open this, we get a nice little window, which we can make a little bit bigger. That looks just like this. So what we do is we rearrange the data a little bit, so that looks a little bit more clear to us. So we put this one over here. We move the right channel below that. We move the left channel over here and the L-mon on top of that, and we put the reference somewhere in the middle. I've arranged a little bit better. Now we can see them a little bit bigger. We can make it smaller and bigger. We can zoom the actual traces, the whole little window. So let's move that back to where it was. Okay, that's good. If we wanted, we can save this arrangement as ABR arrangement. So next time when we open another file, we are actually at the same place, so we don't have to rearrange all the time. Immediately though, we can see beautifully the stimulus artifact again, wonderfully. Again, going down first, our trace is going up with the negativity showing up. Again, there are positive potentials, the ABR, but because of the configuring in the ActiveTwo, they would actually go downwards rather than upwards. So we have to just switch them upwards, and that's all fine. Again, we can see the stimulus artifact on the stimulated channel. This is the left side. Immediately we can see this particular down going, and again, one amplitude going up. That is our fifth trace. We can see the actual timing. It's 5.8 milliseconds. So nicely, we can just mark this little thing by going across it. We can say find and mark peak. So we can put a waveform 5 there. And I'm pretty sure, again, that this one here, if we mark this one, it'll be waveform 1. It actually automatically indicated that. BESA does that very beautifully. So we can put 1 there. There is 1, there is 5. Obviously, if we wanted, we could export that file and do some better analysis using some other software. But I think this more or less shows us beautifully that using the EMS surpass as a clicker, using 80 decibel on the left ear, 30 decibel less, 50 decibel on the right ear, a white noise masking will give us a beautiful potential using our ABR electrodes, which are special electrodes, cannot be done with the standard electrodes of the ActiveTwo, because the actual recording we can see up here, that's the L-mon, that's the R-mon. Let's just make sure that let's put the reference again to where they should be. They moved the channels now. That's because we didn't save it as that. So let's just move them back here so we can quickly see. So right again goes over here, and the right channel goes on top, the left, we just move down here again. Let's put that back here. So let's beautifully save that. Save arrangement, just gonna overwrite this particular one here. So next time we don't have to do it again. Now, obviously looking at that, we have now the L-mon and the R-mon no longer as monopolar channels, but they're now also referenced. And that's why they become more similar to the actual ABR channels that use bipolar and AC channels, so 100 Hertz to 3.3 kilohertz, just like that. If we wanted, we can move them on top of each other like so, and we can see it's more or less the same. We can, in fact, what we can also do is, I think we can show an overplot, and the overplot shows us nicely our traces here which would be around here, would be waveform 5 on all the channels, nicely superimposed. I think we can wrap up and saying Surpass has done a beautiful stimulation, click stimulation. The ActiveTwo has done a wonderful acquisition using the special ABR electrode setup. We can prove it. It's right here on the screen. In fact, sorry, we should have actually moved them correctly. It's now more appropriate. So what we do, we just save that again. Just override this particular one again. So next time we open this again, we can just load an arrangement so that it would look exactly the same. We will do the same now with presentation and compare the data, and that would finalize our last take today on doing auditory evoked potentials on the ActiveTwo. We're going to pull in the one-shot triggering presentation stimulus file now from Philip to compare with what we've done with a very accurate stimulus output system from EMS. So let's open the file called presentation stimulation. Again, you have to make sure you click that to PDF file because otherwise I won't see the file. Here it is. Let's open it up. Again, it creates a demographic file for Philip. So there are our 6 channels. Remember the 6 channels being L-mon, ref, R-mon, left, right, and the status channel. Let's again define this channel as bad from the beginning. Otherwise, we will average that as well, which we don't want to do. We can apply a user montage, which we already created using the Surpass file. So now this file is connecting L-mon to the reference, ref to ref, that's why it's flat, R-mon to ref, left and right, these two, again, bipolar channels. If I go to change the sensitivity, I can go to about 20 microvolts, that's okay. And we can go to about 100 milliseconds, that's fine. We can see immediately a large stimulus artifact, respectively a 50 Hertz artifact, that's okay. Let's just hit change some filter settings. Let's go to 100 Hertz to 3 kilohertz. And let's apply a notch filter so we won't see the 50 Hertz anymore, because that was probably either the USB cable or the power supply of my laptop or whatever. So immediately the 50 Hertz is gone, waveforms look much better. When we scroll into the waveform, suddenly we can see triggers coming through. Now, remember when we opened the Surpass triggered file, which used a TTL trigger into the USB receiver because the EMS Surpass had a trigger output, and we hadn't compromised the safety of the subject because we're going the USB way, the digital triggering way. We're not going the analog way of ergo input, which we call one-shot triggering way. We actually supply triggers into the high byte section, which is 9 to 16. Remember, the USB receiver has 16 inputs, whereas the first 8 inputs are allocated to TTL triggers coming from the stimulation device via the digital output. Whereas here we're going into the high byte section using an analog input through the ergo, which is actually routed to the trigger inputs 9, 10, 11, and 12. Again, analog triggers, very important. And the markers that we see on screen are markers 256, which are right down the bottom. So what we do is now, we're not going to do much here with this file. We go straight to ERP. We go straight to average. And this time we call it ABR2. We define, we set, we add to list, we set. So 256 markers or triggers will be allocated and averaged around to our presentation stimulation file. And we call this ABR press, which the previous code, current code is 256. Insert, we should have done much more. We should have actually done it vice versa. With the surpass stimulator, we could have done 1667 sweeps, whereas with the presentation, we should have gone up to about 4000 because we used really, really bad headphones, which is good because we want to see how does it really look with a low quality material, giving you anyway a better price because you can use your own headphones. Obviously, we always suggest Etimotic research headphones because they're the best, whether they be ER1, 2 or 3s, you can use all three of them. Let's go to epoch. Epoch, again, we set 0 to 10 milliseconds. We don't use baseline definition for this particular case. We don't do an artifact rejection. We don't have a delay because we didn't use insert earphones from Etimotic with the rubber tube. We used inner ear earphones that go straight in, and the little coil sits right, basically almost on the eardrum. And let's assign that to all. We go to filter. Let's not do the filtering. We can do that offline. We could do an artifact scan again. We only have 6 channels or 5 channels. It doesn't make a difference. We click to average. We hit ABR presentation and we hit the average button. That takes about a minute or two, and I will be back as soon as this has averaged. I can see on the screen it's still going, only another 100 sweeps, and it's finished now. So again, we can save this with another name if you wanted to. We can leave a comment, so we just let it go like that. And that will bring up again the average buffer. Let's get rid of that screen quickly because we don't want to kill the surprise. So we're looking at a average buffer from the left to the right. Again, let's put a different sensitivity, and let's actually put that down to about 100 millisecond full screen. So from the left to the right against 100 milliseconds. Obviously, we averaged on 10 milliseconds. Go to user, montage, and choose the ABR set. So here we go. That looks, it doesn't look like anything because we can't say, let's just put the sensitivity down a bit. Well, we can see something, but we can't do actually an analysis on that. Again, we've connected the left and the right to reference, making these two bipolar channels. But again, these are like the EEG channels of the ActiveTwo, whereas these left and right channels are the special channels. They're the bipolar, amplified, bandwidth channels, left and right. The left was stimulated. However, using presentation, I have to be honest, we couldn't mask the other ear. I'm sure we could, but we didn't. So we supplied the stimulus on the left and the right. This is our results. Can't see much of a stimulus artifact. In fact, when I go to overhead view, you can see a very big stimulus artifact because these headphones are just terrible. We used some old inner ear headphones of whatever brand. So let's go up to, again, to top view of the data. In fact, I think we can load an arrangement. So we have to go back to the surpass arrangement, and here it is. Let's just open that, and it puts it nicely where it's supposed to be. Beautiful. In fact, we can make them a little bit bigger. We can zoom the actual traces. That's good. Immediately, we can actually see a response, and the response is actually not bad. Now, let's just check on the filters. There is no filters applied. So we should really apply some filters. So we put in 100 Hertz to 3 kilohertz. And we will apply a notch filter because, again, everything on the same table, USB receiver right next to ADC box, which is typically not done in a normal setup. So we put 50 Hertz to get rid of that. And when we actually open our overhead display again, top view of the data, We can see the data is much nicer now. We can actually move this one and sort of superimpose it with the right channel, and we can see the waveforms 1 to 5 are quite nicely seen. So 5, I assume, is around here. I think that's pretty safe to say. Whereas on the right channel, the ABR is much better. And that's probably because we didn't calibrate the output and we supplied the sound to the left and to the right ear. No masking, as we did with the dedicated system. I'm sure that with Presentation or any other program, maybe you can use the Chronos with E', that will probably give you better responses. But I think it's fair to say that what we've acquired is not really that bad using pretty bad earphones. As well as you can't see the stimulus artifact, you remember beautifully using a TDH39 that we had a wonderfully downgoing, because it wasn't rarefaction, downgoing, upgoing, big stimulus artifact swinging out to about 1 millisecond. And then we were seeing the waveform 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 beautifully. Here it's not as simple to see as we would have anticipated. But still, we're getting a response. I think it's good to see waveform 5 probably around here. Again, the output was much lower, so probably stimulating maybe 40, 50 decibel, giving us a bit of a delayed waveform here. Obviously, the whole setup will constitute to some more delays there. I don't know, the audio card, sound card, as in respect to our music box that we connected to it, and the headphones we took, etc., will constitute to the results as we're looking at. But still, we can see waveforms 1 to 5 quite beautifully. Now let's compare this with the Surpass. So we close this down, we just go to export, and we say, let's export this data file. Let's export it into the Surpass directory and export it onto the Surpass. When I click save, it will say, well, target file already exists. Do you want to append? Yes, we do. So we click yes. And what we will end up with, we have to open the file. We have to go to Surpass and we open this file here. In fact, we're opening this file here. It's an FSG file, it's an average file. And we open this. We need to set those filters correctly as well. So we go back to 3000, put the notch filter back. And we say okay to that. In fact, what we do is we change the time base, go back to our 100 milliseconds, say close to that. Immediately we can see the 2 average buffers on the screen. However, we also need to apply our montage again. And now we're looking at 2 average buffers. One is the Surpass acquisition and average, and the other one is the presentation stimulus average. It says it on the button, Surpass presentation. We can see we should have done here 1600 and here 4000. I totally agree with anyone who would like to comment on that. And that's okay, because I'm just showing you how it works. And so when we go to view and we go to top view of the data, we can now see, when we make this bigger, we can actually put the hand on the shift button, and we can click also this one here, giving us the display on the 2 waveforms superimposed. And yes, it looks like the presentation file actually created nicer traces, whereas remember, we stimulated on the Surpass, we stimulated the actual left ear with a suppression of the right ear with minus 30 decibels, whereas with the presentation file, we stimulated both ears. That's why we're getting quite good responses using the presentation stimulation method, using one-shot triggering. Remember, here was waveform 5, and with presentation, it seems On the left ear, it's been a bit earlier, whereas on the other side, we have waveform 5 on the right ear, actually spot on, whereas on the right ear using presentation, this will be delayed, and that's probably also due to the loudness of the sound that we produced. I think this pretty much gives a nice presentation of what you can actually do using a dedicated stimulation system such as the Surpass from Austria, which is a fantastic system. You find it on our shop. You in fact find also combined packages, low-cost packages, or we call it, I think, basic packages using presentation, the one-shot triggering analog setup from BioSemi, and the Auditory Evoked Potential stimulus setup versus a dedicated, more expensive, obviously, stimulation apparatus by EMS, which is not cheap, but it allows you also to do mid-latency response, cortical response, P300, you name it, you can do it, all the Auditory Evoked Potential stuff. You can stimulate, in fact, you can use it as a standalone Auditory Evoked Potential system, which I consider one of the best on the planet currently available. And you can find these on our shop. I think this wraps it up. I hope you liked the 3-part series of how to do Auditory Evoked Potentials. Subscribe to our channel. We'd love to see your face again when you log in, when you watch the videos that we present. Please give us a like if you did like it. If you don't like it, comment why you don't like it. But otherwise, we'd be happy to continue to make videos for you so you can learn stuff, you can compare with your own setup, and hope you really enjoyed what we've tried to do here. So we say goodbye at this point, and we will see you another time. Thank you very much for joining.